This week, I'm doing a kind of interlude into Tolkien because I'm backing up into fairy story and thinking about it in terms of these ancient myths and really all stories are are all stories fairy stories? No, but it's a way of thinking about story in general. So Tolkien wrote this text called On Fairy Stories. I'm going to kind of walk through it. And it's an interesting question, like, why do we have fairy stories and why do adults read fairy stories? If you read fairy stories, and I think you should, they are about Tolkien's take on an alternative state of consciousness. So we have consciousness, we are conscious of the world in our general way, but then there's different states of consciousness. There's like a flow state when you're like just grooving with the flow of music, or you're working really well, or you're just really feeling it. There's psychedelic uh flow states. I have not taken any psychedelic mushrooms or anything. I might, at least I'm not planning on it at this point. I don't think I need to. Um, but anyway, people talk about those things. Uh, and that matches what Tolkien is thinking about when he's thinking about what these fairy stories do, and they open you up to extreme openness, and like a psychedelic drug, it kind of erases your memory of the world so that the world just jumps out at you so much more powerfully, and the patterns, even patterns which aren't there, you start to hallucinate. That's like, it's not a good thing. Well, depends on what you're trying to do, I guess. Um, but the world has got a brighter light, it's got a deeper color. And so here's one of the things Tolkien says at the beginning of the essay, which actually was a lecture that he gave. And he says, fairy, F-A-E-R-I-E. So the state of being in fairy, fairy cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. It has many ingredients, but analysis will not necessarily discover the secret of the whole. Okay, so he's right. He's saying, like, this is a really hard thing to describe. You can't catch it in a net of words. It's elusive, like the flow state. I mean, if you think about the flow state, then you lose the flow state. It's like, you can't kind of analyze it, or you kind of lose it. So, and he contrasts the fairy stories, and he's thinking about Beowulf, and he's thinking about um the Green Knight, and these medieval stories and these ancient stories. I think he would classify things like the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, like these ancient Roman stories, as fairy stories. I don't know about Genesis from the Bible, or the Quran. I think he would, but anyway, he doesn't say. Um, and he's contrasting these fairy stories with like a kind of fake fairy story, or a poorly done, from his perspective, fairy story, like Shakespeare's Macbeth. And you might think, like, that's a great work of art, and I think it is. But he's thinking about it that there's things like, when you have witches, like, how do you do witches? Beings who have magical power and are evil. And from Tolkien's perspective, Shakespeare Macbeth doesn't do that good of a job. Part of the thing is, Tolkien says that there's a difference between a fairy story, kind of narrative story, and a drama. And Shakespeare's doing a drama. And I think I have a little quote here. Let's go to the whiteboard, which really is just a white piece of paper here. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Okay, you should. Why? Oh, there it goes. Okay. So in this middle thing, just ignore it. I already read this thing up here. In this middle thing, what I have here is Tolkien's distinction between the drama, the play, and the fairy story or the fantasy story or the narrative. And in the drama, he says it has a substitute magic, the visible and audible presentation of imaginary men in a story. So you're seeing and hearing these people on a stage, and they've got clothing, they've got costumes, they've got sound effects. So that's what he's calling a substitute magic. Whereas a fairy story is it's just words on a page or that you're hearing someone tell you audibly, but you're not kind of seeing it. You have to use your imagination. So and for Tolkien, the drama reaches its highest form in tragedy. So the Shakespearean tragedies, or Oedipus the King, or ancient tragedies, that's what it tends to. And I don't know, I don't agree with him, to be honest. But anyway, but let's just work with him for a second here. And he says that the fairy story, its characteristic ending is the happy ending, the Eucatastrophe. We're going to get to the EU, which means good catastrophe, that Tolkien defines, and this becomes a major term in all literary analysis. Okay, so that's what he says about drama, and Tolkien will talk about Faerian drama, Faerian like fairy, Faerian drama. So the dramas that fairies do or that elves do. And he says this: if you are present at a Faerian drama, you yourself are, or think that you are, bodily inside its secondary world. So he's got the primary world, which is our world, the secondary world, which is the world of the narrative, of the story. And he says the Faerian drama is so powerful in its enchantment that you feel like you are in that world. And he's going to say, I think, that really good human stories approach that you feel like you're in that world. I think there's a kind of just a simple way that makes sense. Like, yeah, when you're watching a movie or hearing a story, you're kind of identified with the character. You might be like ducking because like you see things coming at you. Yeah, you sort of feel like you're in it. But there's there's more to it than that. And so I've got another chart here. So let's think about what Tolkien is saying about literary art, storytelling, and magic. And he does this weird thing on fairy stories, which I'm still trying to get a hold of, where for him magic kind of means science. What? Because what a magician tries to do for Tolkien is control the world, dominate the world, manipulate the world using techniques, using like whether that's a magic technique or like a scientific technique or a technological technique. So anyway, let me go to my little chart here and see if I can make sense of this here to myself and hopefully to you. And it has to do here with this chart. So if the magician is trying to do things, and I don't know if you can think about a magician, like let's take Sauron, or I mean Sauron is probably like the kind of prototypical magician, someone who wants to control and totally take over the world. It's goes back to biblical stories like the Tower of Babel, where humans said we're going to take over the world. we're going to build our own stairway to heaven, our own tower where we can reach the heavens, where we don't need any intervention by supernatural forces, or we're going to make a name for ourselves. We're not going to let other people give a name for us. So it's this desire to totally control, and it's a human tendency that all humans tend to this. And these are words from Tolkien. Tolkien says it's a desire for power. Its desire is power, domination of things, and wills. Yeah, so that's very much like Sauron. That's like Saruman. And he says it's not an art, but a technique. Whereas literary art, good storytelling, good fantasy storytelling, whether that's by elves or by humans, is an enchantment. Enchant actually means magic. Let me get a quick drink of my water here. And allergy season anyway. I'm gonna have to get a cough drop actually. Oh, excuse me. And it's a really potent art that produces secondary belief. And he kind of says like elves. Now I know elves don't exist, but he's just imagining elves, that they're experts at enchantment. And if you read the Lord of the Rings and other stories by Tolkien, you see this when they go to Rivendell, when they go to Lothlorien, and Sam says he feels like he's in a story, or when Tom Bombadil tells a story, they feel like the things are actually objectively like appearing in front of them physically. So you have the sense that you're in that world. That's elves, that's Tom Bombadil. And then humans, we do our fantasy stories, and when they're really good, they're getting closer to that elvish enchantment. So and he says that elves enchantment has to do with what? The desire for a living, realized, sub-creative art. A living, realized, sub-creative art. So that's like just a good story that grabs you, that enchants you, that overtakes you, and that you kind of enter into. Fantasy tales by elves or good humans, they clean the windows so that the meanings leap out at us. This is this different state of consciousness. And, there could be an objection here that people have raised. One famous person that raised an objection to this was C.S. Lewis, who was a colleague of Tolkien at Oxford. And he started off as an atheist. Tolkien kind of convinced him that first that God existed, and then to become a Christian. It wasn't just Tolkien, but Tolkien was very instrumental. And in their conversations, they were talking about these myths and, Thor and Beowulf that they loved. And Lewis said that these are lies. They're not true. And even when they were breathing a lie through silver, like a really beautiful, awesome story like Beowulf or Balder, C.S. Lewis said that when Balder died, that he wept, that he was so moved, the mythical Norse figure of Balder. But Lewis objected at first, and eventually he gets convinced. But the objection is that this is kind of escapist, that you're like losing touch with reality, because you're like too weak to deal with reality. Your mind is too weak, and you're escapist. And Tolkien says it's not escapist. It's an escape, yes. When you're in prison, it's good to escape. And sometimes we're imprisoned by the modern, dumbed down, reductive world. that's overly hyper analytic, hypercritical, hyper materialistic, and has not, it's got its windows all fogged up, and we need to clean them to get that escape, to get that consolation that these are effects of good fairy storytelling, telling of fairy stories. And you end up with these fairy stories, according to Tolkien, Eucatastrophe, like a big change, a big turn. Catastrophe is usually bad, so it's a Eucatastrophe, EU, Greek. And he says it's the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn. And he adds, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. I mean, he really loves to think about fairy tales as like opening to the real world, like thinking about like there's no end to this thing, that it opens it into reality. Anyway, and Tolkien, he's saying like I agree, like there are discatastrophes, there are bad catastrophes. That's real. The real world has horrible things in it: wars, death, torture, evil people. There is discatastrophe. No argument there. But what Tolkien says is, let me see if do I have this on text? Yeah, let me go to the whiteboard. And here's what Tolkien says. Let me get to my right text here for a second. He says that this good fairy storytelling, what it denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat. And insofar is evangelium, which is Latin for the gospel, giving, or good news, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. And he says it can give an adult a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by, tears as keen as that given by any form of literary art, and having a peculiar quality. So Eucatastrophe and these fairy stories denies final defeat. That even though we see all these defeats, we see all these evil victories by evil and death and destruction, that you're going to get a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world. And what the heck does that mean? And I mean, you could take it to a religious level and say, and Tolkien kind of goes there because he's religious, he's a Christian. And he kind of says that the Christian story, the story of Jesus Christ, is sort of the story. But let's leave that aside, because I don't want to go there. Let's just think about it in terms of transcendence generally. And this is, I'm gonna have to do a thing on transcendence, but that which is beyond what he's calling the walls of this world, the material world, the measurable empirical world, that there's something behind it, above it, or below it, beyond it. It's transcendent. It's and we can never totally see it. It's like that flow state when you try to turn to look at it, it's gone, or it's elusive. That's why we only get a fleeting glimpse of it, and it's poignant as grief. So it's joy, but it's grief. It's like this powerful source of meaning, because we're in a meaning crisis, all of us, at some point, or at all points. In a certain sense, I'm treating meaning crisis as just the human condition. And so we do have this yearning for meaning, an instinct that you can't live without it. It's like food, it's like air. And so we need that. And we need that cleaning of the windows so that we can kind of access something that's transcendent. and it's real. I mean, the critics are going to say, no, it's actually fake. It's a lie, but it's real. It's not. It's partly subjective. It's partly objective. It's definitely in our feelings more than in our intellect. Although I think you need to expand your definition of intellect to include things like the emotional response here, the tears, and so forth. And so so good. So that's what Tolkien says there. And he goes on and he talks about some fairy stories like those by Andrew Lang, who wrote fairy tales. Tolkien has some good things and some bad things to say about them. Here he's saying some good things, and he's saying like, oh yeah, the good fairy tales by Andrew Lang, they have a good quality because of the joy, because the joy has a little of that strange mythical fairy story quality greater than the event described. Strange mythical fairy story quality. So it's strange, elusive, a little bit kind of twisted, not like just like the natural world, and that it's greater than the event described. How can it be greater than the event described? That's that transcendence. It's opening up. There's something more coming in. And he says here, in such stories, when the sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy and heart's desire. And for a moment passes outside the frame, rends indeed the very web of story, and lets a gleam come through us. This is the same wording that Tolkien's doing over and over. Like there's something breaking through. And it's really hard to describe it. So he's trying to like the web of story, and like and it's true that like, why are there stories? I mean, like stories reveal truth that you can't get at through like data or even history. Like you can tell the history of the world, but like these stories, these untrue stories, they're not literally true, but because they've been culled over thousands of years and been compiled into these rich stories, there's more there. There's like tons of human experience kind of embedded in those stories that's accessing wisdom, a wisdom tradition. Okay. And then Tolkien says that these fairy stories, they have kind of two moments. What do I mean by two moments? That when you experience the story, well, here it is, these two moments. And at first, you get the artistic moment, like as an artist or artistically apprehending a story, an artistically story like a great painting, you get joy. It's like, yes, awesome. I love that. I love that painting. I love that story. I love that film. You know that it's art. You apprehend it as art. But then he says, what? He says that the answer may be greater. It may be a far off gleam or echo of evangelium in the real world. And so here's where Tolkien goes full on religious. And I'm going to just glance over that quickly. So, because he says, like, yeah, that for him, he's a Christian. Like the Christian story is the story. It's the story of stories. It's in the tree of tales. It's like the root, and it's the source of everything else. But leaving that aside, whether or not you're a Christian, I think this still makes sense that it's opening up to the transcendent again, that the source of meaning, that if you believe that there's meaning in the world, and I think you have to, if you're going to be able to live at all, there's this source of meaning. There's this story source. There's, it's like a set of values, but it's so much more than values. Values is such a lame word for it. It's about meanings. It's about what makes life worth living. And what was it? There was those three ways of thinking about meaning in life, and forgetting them right now. But one of them was that the world kind of holds together, that it's coherent. Another one was that what you do matters. So like your life matters. Uh, and then I forget what the other one was. But in any case, all those things have to do with meaning. And so this is where we're going. Um, and so these sub-creative human told stories, let me say a few things here. Fairy stories that give that far off gleam or echo in the real world, in our world, in my physical world of my office in Houston, Texas on this day, like that it's here. And it's not that these stories are true, but they clean my windows. They open my consciousness to a different state of consciousness so that I can see something that I couldn't see before. It's not mystical. It's not mystical. It's not wishful thinking. It's not escapism. There's kind of an escape, but at these stories, kind of like I mean, I was going to say like even horrible stories, like Holocaust stories, at the limit of human experience, both positive or negative, we open ourselves up. We can see the glimpse better because we're not kind of getting the noise. We're kind of like we're erasing all the noise, and we're kind of cleaning the windows. And you apprehend something that you cannot put into words, that you can't quite pinpoint. You can't photograph it. It's like those photos of black, what's the guy's name? Bigfoot. Like they're always a little bit, or the Loch Ness monster. Like we're trying to chase these things. You can't quite catch it. Or it's like flow. When you're in a state of flow, you know it. You're feeling it. Whether that's in an athletic event where you're just like totally like really flowing and it's like it feels effortless, or a musical event where you're creating music or you're acting and you're just in your role, or you're working and you're just like really kind of enjoying it. But if you stop to look directly at it, you lose it. And you're sort of you're you're not self-conscious. You're not even conscious of yourself anymore because you're kind of fused with existence, so to speak. Um, you lose yourself in the moment. You got to never let it go, like that song from Eminem. And so that's what fairy stories open us up to. And I hope you get that experience whether you read great fairy stories by Tolkien or by others, or by these ancient myths that we've been going through in the series. So I'm going to leave it off there, and we'll see you soon.